Hello, welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Hope you guys are doing well today. Today's discussion is going to be around provenance. Even more now than ever, I think provenance has become an extremely important part of watch collecting. Some may say that it's actually eclipsed some of the other attributes that collectors look at when they're looking to buy vintage watches. And so I kind of wanted to discuss the idea of provenance, how it can be tricky, but how there are other ways that you can actually enjoy provenance in vintage watch collecting. I think this also goes for modern watch collecting, but it's a little bit easier with vintage watch collecting as you sort of do your research on pieces and identify the watches that may be interesting for your collection. So at its core, I think vintage watch collectors look for many attributes when they're looking at buying pieces. I think this goes for modern, but I'm going to speak about this in terms of vintage watches for the most part. So a couple of the factors that really people look at are things like obviously specific reference numbers that are historic in a brand's history, brands that maybe produced watches in limited quantities are two things that people may consider. I think something that's spoken about a lot is obviously condition. I think condition, I've spoken about this previously, is a spectrum. So some people want something that is completely untouched, completely unworn, like it came from the retailer. But then some other people kind of like a watch that might be a little bit beat up and might show its age and the adventures that it's been on. There's a third dimension here that some people might also look at, which is they don't really mind restoration on a watch as long as it's done well, and they want it to look as in pristine condition as possible. So if their watch is perhaps polished, but it looks like it's completely new, that's something that they really enjoy seeing. One of the attributes as well that people look at is provenance. Provenance in where the watch came, who was the previous owner, how many owners the watch has had, and those types of considerations when it comes to these pieces. And I think the last New York City watch, the last sort of round of watch auctions sort of exemplified this. So as an example, a couple of the pieces that we saw were fresh to market. We saw a fresh to market Patek Philippe reference 1436. We saw a fresh to market reference 3448. Both of those were sold at Phillips. We spoke about these in our New York watch auction preview, actually, so if you want to go back to episode 137 or the episode that we released on June 6th, you can check that out. But there are other pieces that sold that had to do with provenance. So as an example, there was a Patek Philippe pocket watch from 1895 that was owned by Alfred G. Stein, who was a individual who worked for Patek Philippe. Another example is the Speedmaster Apollo 13 that belonged to Jack Swigert Jr. I think one of the most historic ones that we covered on our website, an article and a video, was the Patek Philippe that belonged to the last emperor of China. These watches are obviously historic because you can really point to the person who wore them. You can point to who had this watch on their wrist, the lives that they lived, and that was a huge piece of information that the watch carries. But other ways that provenance are important is some people really like original owner watches. They want watches that came from the original family or belong to the original owner. They don't like pieces that maybe have traded hands a bunch of times, and then you sort of lose the background of the piece and where it's kind of been over its lifetime. The biggest problem with provenance is it's sometimes very hard to track. If you don't have watches that are historically significant, like the pieces that I mentioned, or have original documentation that shows the hands that these watches went through, it can be difficult to prove. But I think more and more, this is becoming an extremely important attribute for people who collect watches. I think condition for a while has been something that was at the forefront of collectors' minds, and I think it still is. But I now think that more and more provenance is extremely important. Now, for an average collector, you might not have access to some of these original owner 1436s or, a Patek Philippe that belonged to last emperor of China. That could be because it's just not a bracket you play in. It could be because these pieces, once sold, don't really trade hands very often. So it's sometimes unattainable for many people in who are interested in collecting watches. But I think that there is an angle that you can come at watches and really enjoy their provenance in a different way. And that's where you find watches that either have a really well-tracked history, and you can speak to the individual who owns it, and they can really point to exactly where the watch has been over its lifetime. Or you can look at pieces that have engravings on the caseback or on the watches themselves that kind of tell a story on their own. Interestingly, we have 3 watches in that have these engravings, and it's quite interesting to own them, to research the watches and understand really the life that they've lived and where they came from. And so I'm going to talk through 3 of them and kind of show you how they can be really, really interesting pieces of history related to these pieces that can get at the idea of provenance from a watch collector's perspective and kind of add value, in my opinion, for those specific watches. Even more importantly, I think these inscriptions actually add some fun to the collecting of these pieces. Sometimes watch collecting can feel a little stale, and I think these are a great way that you can actually enjoy watches in a different dimension, because you'll be researching them in different ways, understanding their history, and daydreaming about where these watches were. I'll start off with a watch that you've probably seen on the Life on the Wrist Instagram quite a bit, and that is an Omega chronograph reference 2279 that has a pretty cool history to it. So if you don't know, the reference 2279 is a stainless steel chronograph, 35 millimeters, and runs in the caliber 321 manual line movement, which is what was used in the original Speedmasters. I encourage you to check out the links in the show notes if you want to see some pictures of this piece. Obviously, we're going to cover it in an article, so stay tuned for that. But I encourage you to take a look at some pictures, because it really is a beautiful chronograph. But if you flip the watch over and you look at the case back, there's a dedication to an O.B. Roberts, and it says, O.B. Roberts, Logan Boone, Mingo area, BSA, 1942 to 1953. So this watch was, according to the serial, originally manufactured in 1950. But you can see the date on this was 1942 to 1953, so you can probably guess that this was sold in 1953. What's really cool is if you look up the Logan Boone Mingo area, and if you know anything about what BSA would stand for, the Logan Boone Mingo area is actually a Boy Scouts council in West Virginia. Now, I wasn't able to find who O.B. Roberts was related to this Boy Scouts council, but based on the amount of years that he spent with this council, he likely wasn't a scout in a troop in this area. And I know I'm speaking a little bit more to the people who know about Boy Scouts, but typically you're in Boy Scouts, or I think it's now called Scouts, for 9 years if you're involved in the programs. So it's likely that O.B. Roberts was a parent, a contributor to this council, who spent 11 years helping this council and all the boys who were involved in this Boy Scouts council during this time. Now, I know that maybe if you don't know anything about Boy Scouts, this isn't really significant to you, but this does tell you a little bit more about this piece. I think you know that it was manufactured in 1950 based on the serial numbers, and you know it probably took 3 years to sell based on the year that this was likely gifted, which was 1953, which is probably the end of the time that this individual, O.B. Roberts, was involved in this council. It's also pretty nice to think that this watch was a gift. This watch was gifted to someone who did a lot of good. I think Boy Scouts did a lot of good during this time period. And so I think that adds some significance to this piece. Whether you're into Boy Scouts, whether you're into chronographs, whether you're into the 1950s time period of watches, there is some significance that this inscription has, and it kind of adds a little bit of value to it, because you know just a few more things about this piece just based on that inscription. Inscriptions are, I think, polarizing. Some people love them, some people hate them. But again, I think this is a great example of how this can add some context and some stories to the watches that you might be wearing on your wrist. I'll move on to the second piece, which is another Omega. It's the reference 1660117. This watch was manufactured in 1972 and is a gold-plated 35mm day-date automatic watch from Omega. Now, what's unique about this piece is the condition that it's in. As I mentioned, condition is a spectrum, but this one certainly is on the side of it shows its age. It's got some interesting oxidation to the watch. But if you want to know about all original, this is exactly it. If you take a loop to this watch, you can actually still see the Omega logo on the original crystal, which I think is fairly significant for this piece. But we're not really talking about condition. We really want to focus on provenance. And so if you look at this watch, you see this very interesting logo towards the 6 o'clock of the dial. Now, I know not everyone is a enthusiast of American baseball. I wouldn't count myself as someone who's interested in it, but I do know sort of maybe some of the logos, and I'd say that when I look at this, I think of the Chicago Cubs. But when you turn the watch over, this watch has a really beautiful hand-engraved dedication that says, "For loyal service, Peanut Haynes, 1974, Continental Can Co. Inc." So again, you can piece together some stories here just by this inscription. The first is that the individual who was gifted this watch originally had a nickname of Peanut, which I think is a really unique, cool, kind of fun attribute of this watch. You know that this watch was gifted in 1974, so manufactured in 1972, gifted in 1974, so it's likely that this watch sold 2 years after it was manufactured. And you know that this went to an individual who worked for the Continental Can Co. Inc. This is a company that was based, I think, in the US, somewhere in the Midwest. And based on its condition, this likely was with Peanut for the duration of his life. It likely has not seen the inside of an Omega service center because of its originality, and I think that is just absolutely romantic to the right collector. It would be cool if this one had how many years Peanut Haynes actually worked for Continental Can Co., but we know that it was for loyal service, so it was likely for a long time. This tradition of gifting watches after working for a company was very common many years ago, and I don't think it's as common now. But to get a watch of such quality for your service, I think, is a fitting gift and something that I wish more and more companies did. So another flavor of what an inscription and really understanding the provenance of a watch, how that adds to the value of a specific piece. And it's just another story that you can tell when you have this watch on your wrist, and you can, if someone asks about it, you can kind of point to the specific story. The last watch I wanted to discuss was from Jaeger-LeCoultre. We actually are going to be writing about this watch for our article tomorrow, so stay tuned for our video and article if you want to read more in depth about this piece. But this watch also has a little bit of provenance added to it. So there's a link in the show notes if you want to check out some pictures of this watch, but essentially this is a stainless steel time-only piece from Jaeger-LeCoultre with a white cream dial, gold applied hour markers. That really is a beautiful watch from 1961. It's running on one of the most impressive movements that they made during this time period, the K478-C manual wind movement, which was very close to the 479 manual movement that was actually fitted in the JLC pilot watches that were delivered to the British RAF in 1945. This was obviously a little bit after that, 1961, so you're looking at about 16 years after that actually happened. But this 33mm case is in really, really great condition, and is one of the reasons why I really do love this piece. Now, of course, if you turn this watch over, you see this really beautiful inscription that says 1961, D. Tracy, over 40 years with C.S. Milne & Co. Limited. this inscription is another example of how romantic this watch can actually get. So it's likely that this inscription points to the idea that this watch was gifted to a D. Tracy for working 40 years with a company named C.S. Milner Co. Limited. Now, doing a little bit of research, it's the company C.S. Milner & Co. was a company that was located in Deptford, South London, in the United Kingdom, and so it's likely that this piece was sold in the UK market, which is another piece of provenance that you can not know. Right now, this watch is located in the USA, and so you know that it somehow came from the United Kingdom over to the USA. If you look up this company, you'll actually find that it was a company that specialized in welding and cutting industrial materials, and they also made these gas carbide bicycle lamps and tools. And for I didn't actually know that there was a market for this, but gas and oil lamp collectors are really into this company's products, and so I think that's really a cool thing to think about. So you understand who this watch was gifted to, you understand how long they worked for the company, and a little bit about the company that this individual worked for, and probably where the person lived, which was South London, when they got this watch. But something that's even cooler when you have these years is to think about what happened when this person got the watch, or what happened when this person started working there. 40 years with the company is essentially unheard of nowadays. And so first off, that's an incredible amount of years for this person to have worked for the company. But then you put yourself in the shoes of that person when they started with C.S. Milner & Co. 1921, that was just after World War I had ended. And if you think about all the current events that happened, it really romanticizes the watch so much, and I think adds a lot of value to it. Just to name a couple of things, and I write about this in the article, this was when the US and Germany signed the Treaty of Berlin for peace after the war. This was the year that the Communist Party of China was formed. This was the year that Coco Chanel introduced Chanel No. 5. And there's some other events that happened this year, but when you put yourself in the shoes of when that person started, it really puts into perspective how significant this watch is for that individual. So provenance is an interesting term, and I think it's become more and more important. You know, these individuals like D. Tracy or this individual O.B. Roberts from the Omega 2279, they weren't Paul Newman, they weren't former presidents of companies, they weren't the last emperor of China, but the little piece of history adds a story to the piece, and I think that's why provenance can be such a cool thing for collectors to consider when they're building a collection or doing research on pieces that they want to add to their collection. And I think it adds a little bit of accessibility to watches with provenance, and kind of describes provenance in a different way. And I think that is why that's why it's becoming more and more important, because at the end of the day, these watches tell time, but I think the stories that they hold are even more important. And I think that's exciting for any collector at any level. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. As always, if you wouldn't mind doing the normal podcast things of reading this podcast and sharing it with a friend who might be interested in watches. I'd love to hear your thoughts. My question for the day is, what do you think about provenance? Can it go beyond the pieces that belong to former presidents and famous individuals? And do you enjoy pieces with stories that you can track? I'd love to hear your thoughts. So you can send us an email, hit us up on our social media accounts. We'd love to hear from you, so be sure to do that. If you are not following this podcast, be sure to follow us. And with that said, guys, thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and until next time.